I have to say, I am so excited to be here today, especially to be in this room full of women in enterprise tech. In my entire career, I think outside of the Grace Hopper Conference, I have never been in any sort of meeting or event or anything that has this many fantastic women involved. So growing up, I loved mysteries and spy stories. One of my favorite books was Harriet the Spy, and I was so inspired by everything I read. I mean, I even started a detective club at the age of 9 for all of the unsolved cases that needed to be addressed in my neighborhood. And so, one of the questions is, how does this little girl who grew up fascinated by espionage end up starting an enterprise technology company? So I grew up in Wisconsin, in a suburb right outside Milwaukee. And I guess because it is freezing cold in that state for the majority of the year, we spent a lot of time indoors reading. That was what my whole family did. I mean, our basement, this is an actual picture of part of our basement, a very small segment, was essentially a library. My mom loved reading literature and fiction, and my father, who had focused on history throughout his academic career, loved reading everything about the world wars. So for Christmas, we would honestly give him 1,100-page books that would be titled things like Hitler and Stalin, Parallel Lives. And it was like the best gift we could provide. And so that love of reading was really passed on to all of us, to the extent where every summer we would actually drive from Wisconsin to Boston. So my parents, me, and my 2 younger brothers in a car overnight. And the way my parents would incent us to not complain about the trip is that they would promise to stop in Ann Arbor, which is not really on the way in terms of that trip, to buy us books. And so that was the environment that I grew up in, loving reading. Whenever there was free time, we would read. We weren't actually even interested in watching Saturday morning cartoons because we had so many books. So you can imagine my surprise when one day, in 1984, my parents somehow decided to become early adopters of the home computer. And they brought home a TI-99 4A. This is the actual UI at that point in time. It was very, very fancy graphics. And it was fantastic. All of a sudden, we could start playing these games with ASCII graphics, like Defender, which was kind of an olden days version of Space Invaders, and Donkey Kong. But what was even more exciting from my perspective is that the computer had a book that came with it. And with this book, I was actually able to teach myself BASIC. So how many people in here write code or have written code in the past? Okay. How many people in here know how to write BASIC? Yes. Okay, fantastic. And Julia, which was very exciting to hear. So while this was a really great, accessible way to get into computers, I mean, you have to understand, I was operating in a household where math and science, while encouraged, that was not the focus at all of what we did. And so ultimately, I moved to the East Coast for college. I went to Princeton University, and I majored in civil engineering and architecture. And the only thing I would say that I knew with 100% confidence when I graduated from Princeton was that I absolutely did not want to be a civil engineer, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life at all. So I took a job for a year in consulting, and I got to do some programming, which was pretty exciting, but I was feeling really lost. Like, this was not why I had gone to school for. This wasn't challenging. This wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. And all of a sudden, I also found myself with a lot more free time than I had had in a long time, and so I kind of revisited my love of reading and reading for fun. And I read this book, The Code Book by Simon Singh, which is a history of encryption. And from that, I started reading about quantum computing and the history of computers, and it kind of all brought back that kind of throughout my education, the things that had been really exciting and interesting to me were around computer science. And I determined this is the area that I actually want to be working in. But how do I go find a job in that area? My parents were not software developers or engineers and really had no idea of what those opportunities might look like. And so I started doing research online. I went to one of those huge conventions at the Javits Center where I collected a whole slew of marketing brochures that really were unintelligible to me. I had no idea what any of the companies did. But I somehow was lucky enough to come across this company, Akamai Technologies. Now, who here has heard of Akamai? Okay, oh, that's a lot more, actually, than I anticipated. So Akamai was founded in 1998, coming out of MIT by a professor and his graduate student. And really, the whole premise of Akamai was this idea that you could address internet congestion by dynamically routing end users to the optimal server. And I found this fascinating. It was so exciting to have this opportunity to work at a company that had these pure mathematical algorithms as its core underpinning, but also was addressing it to a real-life practical problem, this challenge of internet connection, because the internet in those days did not work, let's just say, as it does today. And so I looked at this company, which, as I read through their financial filings, it looked like, best case scenario, they had maybe a year of cash left in the bank. And I weighed that against the opportunity to really learn about the architecture of the internet and working with something that was essentially a true distributed computing platform before the time when people were really talking about that. And I determined that, if it's the worst case scenario, all right, I have a year there, I get some great experience, and I move on, and we see what happens. And so before I started at Akamai, after I'd accepted the job, they sent me this package with these materials. And my first reaction was like, my company is sending me free books. Like, this is absolutely the greatest thing that could ever happen to me. What was really exciting, though, is that not only were you, and I use exciting loosely, not only were you expected to read all of these books, but actually on your very first day of work, you were expected to show up and do a presentation to the team members on Akamai's three-stage mapping process. Essentially, the whole core of the technology that they had written their senior thesis on around the bipartite Minkowski algorithms and how you could actually use that in adopting consistent hashing. And I mean, I had no background in this, and I needed to go present to a team of experts. But I think in many ways, that almost exemplified Akamai's culture. These were the expectations of what you had to do, and so you had to figure out some way to get it done. And so not only was Akamai this great just foundation for my career in enterprise technology, I would note, while my original intention was to spend 1 year there, I actually ended up spending 11. So I learned a lot about security and data analytics, but also, almost more importantly, I learned so much about what's required to run a business and all of the other skills that are necessary. So for example, how do you actually go talk to customers and translate their requirements into a product? And as mentioned before, how do you actually exert influence when you may not have any formal authority over people? And let me tell you, those are the hard things to figure out, because it's one thing, actually, and it's a very deep challenge, for example, to build a distributed key management infrastructure. It is a whole different challenge to walk into a major financial institution and convince them that they should give you their security certificates so that you can distribute them on hundreds of thousands of servers around the globe, and they'll have no access to it. And so Akamai was just this incredible experience in terms of really understanding not just the technical depth, but all of these other things involved in actually building and running a company. And I know it was mentioned before, and it seems like a number of people in here have worked in product over the years. But in many ways, product is such a challenging role within a company. There's product marketing, there's product management, there's product development, and quite honestly, a lot of times nobody knows what they're actually supposed to do, because you know what sales does, you know what engineering does, but what does product do and how do you define it? And I think one of the really interesting things why that's so hard is if you look at early stage companies, it's the founders that are serving that product role. So for those of you that have worked in product, or even if your title doesn't say that, you actually may have access to a whole wealth of ideas and experience that are exactly right and exactly the right skill set to be developing if you do have that ambition of starting a company. Now, after a number of years, my time at Akamai was divided in two parts. After a number of years, I went back to graduate school at MIT because while I had had a lot of experience in terms of the practical application of technology and development, I felt like I was missing some of the core theoretical underpinnings, and I really wanted to learn a lot more about network congestion and queuing theory and the like. And also, I ended up deciding to go to MIT, but aside from MIT's obvious reputation in computer science, they had this class, Cold War Science, that I really wanted to take because I had been reading these books, like The Making of the Atomic Bomb, just some light reading in my spare time. But there was a whole class about those sorts of things at MIT, and it was so exciting to me because when it came down to it, what I was really interested in was this interplay between foreign policy and technology. And so I developed a lot more of the theoretical underpinnings from the technology side while at MIT. But I was also kind of still struggling as I left there because I was interested in how technology can actually inform strategic events. And so much of the work about policy and technology was much more of how do you put in place the appropriate policy framework to dictate the uses of technology. So I ended up going back to Akamai after my time at MIT. I had this great opportunity to really help lead an effort in which we were analyzing the 30% of internet traffic that Akamai had visibility into. And it wasn't just from a technical perspective, it was also this idea that we could build out an entire business unit from sales through product to engineering, working with early adopter customers. I mean, again, almost the exact type of skill set that you really need to do if you're going out and starting a company. But it got to the point where Akamai was no longer the challenge for me that it had been in the early days. And this was really tough for me personally because I loved this company. Like, I felt so invested in having helped build it. And now I felt like I had outgrown it. And so what am I supposed to do now? How do I even find my path at this point? And there was this great book I came across, What Color is Your Parachute? Which, in case you can't tell, is a little off my typical reading list at this point. But it's filled with all of these exercises that you can do to try and figure out what your path is. And there was one in particular that really resonated with me. You make a 2x2, the typical 2x2 quadrant, mapping your knowledge against your interests. And I'm actually going to show you what I ended up coming up with. And what was very clear to me is that, first of all, if I think about what I want to do, I need to be focused on the things that actually coincide with what I'm interested in, even if I don't necessarily yet have the knowledge to make them happen. And so I spent a lot of time making up a list of options, which ranged from everything from being an intelligence analyst in Vietnam, of which I was completely unqualified for. I mean, I had gone to Vietnam on vacation or something, to taking a product or engineering leadership role in an early stage startup. But the challenge is that what I really wanted to do and what I had been thinking about since I had originally started at Akamai was that I actually wanted to be part of an initial R&D team that ended up developing technology that would be the foundation for a technology company. And so the challenge was, like, since I knew that, I was actually in this situation where it was impossible for me to do anything else. And so I felt really stuck. Because the reality of the situation was I didn't actually think I could start a company. I had no idea how to go about doing it. I didn't think I had the skills. I didn't know where to start. And then from a personal perspective, my husband was incredibly supportive of this idea. I mean, there's nothing he wanted me to do more, so I would stop talking about it. But my husband, I had 2 young kids. And I honestly felt like I would effectively be sacrificing our financial stability by making this choice to pursue this path. And so the question is, well, what do you do? And so I'll tell you a bit of a random story about what ended up happening. I was on the 6 a.m. flight from LaGuardia to Logan. And I don't know about people here, but I hate flying. I'm scared to death of flying, even though I have to fly all the time. I hate talking to people on planes. And I certainly hate talking to people on planes at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I'm sitting on the plane, the seat next to me is empty, and an individual gets on who I've known professionally, Roger Desai, the founder and CEO of Payphone, another company based here in New York. He gets on and he asks me if the seat's empty and if he can sit down. And I'm like, of course, because I will be polite. And we started talking. And I guess because it was this combination of it was 6 a.m. and I was concentrating so hard on managing my fear of flying, when the conversation got around to somehow him asking me what I wanted to be doing, I told him I wanted to start a security intelligence company. I'm a relative stranger who's asking this out of politeness. And his response to me was, you should, and let me see how I can help. And then he followed up with me that same day and sent me an email, and we scheduled time for the following week. And he sat down with me to just kind of talk through what I was thinking about and ultimately made introductions. And honestly, it was just based on his experience as a founder and wanting to encourage other founders, especially in the New York City area, and also really trying to help them avoid making the same mistakes he had. He went out of his way to just help me. And the biggest value that he had is that he believed in me. I was so scared to actually admit that that's what I wanted to do because I didn't think I could do it. And all along, I just needed somebody to actually provide some level of belief. And so as I thought about this and really made this determination of, okay, well, do I actually do this? I again thought a lot about the best case and worst case scenario. So what's the best case? Best case is company is super successful, and I love what I'm doing every day, and I'm constantly learning, and I can be proud of the work I've done. Worst case scenario, everything's a total disaster and fails, but more importantly, I guess from a personal perspective, is that I've now placed this huge financial burden on my family with intent, like knowingly doing this. And I struggled over this for so long. And what's interesting and what I realized soon after I made the decision is that actually, the financial stability actually was not the worst case scenario for me. My worst case scenario was inertia and inaction, and being stuck in this predetermined story with a really boring ending. And so 3.5 years ago, I founded UpLevel. And I'm so excited because in many ways, at the highest levels, it's bringing together what I apparently knew all along, but it took me a very long time to find out that what my real interests were around how you can incorporate the geopolitical context into your detailed understanding of computer science and the internet architecture. And so I'm very excited about the work that we're doing at UpLevel because from a technical perspective, we're applying graph theory to the technical artifacts of cyber attacks. And there's so much interesting work in that area in terms of data modeling and data analysis and how graphs can actually evolve over time. But it's also addressing a real business problem. There are significant challenges that Fortune 1000 enterprises are facing in terms of dealing with cyber attacks. And one of the critical ones is not just the inefficiency of their security operations teams, but the fact that they don't have any perspective on any of the historical attacks that they've been experiencing. And so when I look at this decision to kind of ultimately finally leave and start my own company, I think the biggest lesson that I've learned, and the one thing that I hope everybody would take away from this, is stop waiting for permission. I was waiting for so long for somebody to tell me that yes, you're ready, you can do this, you should do it. You will never be ready. No one will ever be able to tell you that you can do this if you don't actually tell them what you want to do. But more importantly, what matters is whether you think you can do it. And you should. You should not be the only thing standing in your way. So in closing, I'm really excited about this point in time for women in enterprise technology. I think we are at this very unique period where the story about women in enterprise technology is just starting to be written. And we have the opportunity to be the people who do that. So let's make this story something worth reading. Thank you.